All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. If you are tuning in to watch the panel Climate Migration, Understanding Challenges and Generating Solutions to Address the Crisis, you are in the right place. My name is Maggie Gratz, Deputy Chief of Staff to the President at Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. We have an impressive group of people here with us, and I want to thank them all, and again, all of you who are watching from your homes, offices, in many cases, I imagine from your home offices, for your time and interest in this critical topic. A few housekeeping items for our audience before we get started. This session will be recorded and circulated after the event. We encourage you to share it with your colleagues, your family members, and your friends. We are also live streaming on Facebook as we speak. If you experience any technical issues throughout our webinar today, you can always log on to Facebook, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, and see our conversation there. There will be a question and answer section towards the end of the hour. Therefore, please at any point, feel free to submit your question via our Zoom question and answer box at the bottom of your screens, as well as through Facebook. Simply comment with your question. A final note, this will be one of LRS's many discussions about climate migration and the impacts of climate change on immigrants and refugees. I hope that you will continue to engage with us. You can do so through our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all at the handle at LIRS.org, as well as through our website. Before we turn it over to LIRS President and our fantastic panelists today, it's my honor to introduce Colin O'Mara, who will provide our introductory remarks. Colin O'Mara serves as President and CEO of the National Wildlife Federation, America's largest wildlife conservation organization. Prior to the National Wildlife Federation, Colin led the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control as Cabinet Secretary from 2009 through 2014. His previous board service includes a term as co-chair of the Natural Resources and Agricultural Subcommittee of the President's Task Force on Climate Adaptation and Preparedness, chair of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, chair of the Ozone Transport Commission, chair of the Climate and Energy Subcommittee of the Environmental Council of the States, and the Executive Council of the Chesapeake Bay Program. Colin, thank you again, and I give you the mic.
Great, no, thank you, Maggie, and thank you all for joining us. I'm sure some of you have probably been thinking about climate migration for a long time. I'm guessing there's others that are on the line right now that saw the term and maybe hadn't seen it before or hadn't thought about it. And right now, just in the U.S., we have families across the Southeast that have faced horrific hurricanes that have been displaced in their homes and are trying to get back, in many cases trying to rebuild. We have families across the West, particularly in Oregon and California, that have had their communities absolutely ravaged by wildfires. Along the Missouri River in the middle of the country, we've had family farms and communities completely flooded by just record flooding earlier this year. Now, the climate impacts that we're seeing all across the country are leaving in its wake just an absolute trail of destruction affecting communities and individuals. And that's just in the US, right? That's, we've seen horrific, mudslides in other parts of the country. We've seen record typhoons in the Pacific. We've seen all kinds of extreme weather events affecting communities. And the estimates are as many as 200 million individuals could be displaced by climate events in over the next 30 years by 2050. And so having a conversation where one of the nation's leading resettlement organizations, the Lutheran Immigration Refugee Service, comes together with organizations like mine, the National Wildlife Federation, to talk about how do we put together policies that reflect the scientific reality and the work that's incredibly important on climate with kind of the best thinking on how we resettle individuals that are displaced, whether that's internally within a country or whether that's across borders, is going to be increasingly important. Now, this is the topic that is being forced upon us right now. And the reason the National Wildlife Federation is so heavily involved is that as America's largest wildlife conservation organization, we do a lot of work on climate, but we also do a lot of work on kind of trying to reduce emissions, trying to reduce impacts, but we also do a lot of work on really trying to find ways to make communities more resilient and really helping communities that are affected. And so you have one of our leading experts right now, Faye Matthews, who does work for us in the Gulf, on this panel today to talk about the real-time experience of folks in the Gulf that are literally losing the ground under their feet as extreme weather and sea level rise take some of these coastal communities and puts them underwater. And so this is a huge topic. It's one that doesn't get nearly enough attention. And we spend so much time talking about power plants and electric vehicles and the different sources of emissions. But this is the reality. We have millions of Americans that are already being affected by climate, and more that will be displaced in the months and years ahead. Globally, it's a massive challenge. And obviously there are huge inequities, particularly in the global South, about the options that individuals have as they're affected. But nearly 80% of people around the world live within a few miles of water. And so when you see a lot of these kind of extreme weather events fueled, particularly the hurricane and the flooding, the number of folks affected is going to be massive. Now is the time to start planning. Now is the time to get the policies in place. And so I just can't say enough good things about LIRS, and we are incredibly grateful to Krish Vignaraja for her amazing leadership. I'm of course biased, but I think she's outstanding, and I look forward to the panel today.
Thank you, Colin. It is not a coincidence that we do share the Omera. Colin is my husband. But really, thank you, Colin, for your remarks and giving us an overview of the environmental impacts and highlighting how climate migration is not only a foreign issue that affects the Maldives, Australia. I know we already have a question about the Rohingya Muslims, but also here in the southeastern and western parts of the United States. So really appreciate those introductory remarks. Hello, everyone, and welcome to LIRS's inaugural Climate Week event. My name is Krish Vignaraja, and I'm so excited to be a part of this global and virtual effort to bring attention, inform, as well as empower communities to address the climate crisis. As mentioned, I serve as president and CEO of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, the largest faith-based nonprofit dedicated to immigration and refugees. We're one of the oldest refugee agencies in the United States, and for 80 years, LIRS has assisted forcibly uprooted people from really all over the globe. Our decades of experience with migrants and refugees have helped us get a better understanding as we've worked with families and individuals fleeing, in particular, conflict and persecution. Operating in nearly every state in the United States through hundreds of local service providers, LIRS works to rebuild refugees' lives in America, finding safe and loving homes for unaccompanied children until we can reunite them with their families, as well as delivering workforce training to strengthen local economies and empower our immigrant clients. But increasingly, we're seeing an unprotected group seeking refuge, people who are forced to flee due to environmental changes, a reality that is further complicated when families and individuals move into territories or neighboring countries with high rates of violence and poverty, and so become vulnerable to those risks as well. Climate displaced persons face the reality of lacking protections under US and international law, making it impossible to assist them directly under our current system. But indirectly, we are responding to climate displacement today because 2/3 of all migration today is caused by the climate crisis. And so the effects on vulnerable populations and the consequences cannot be overstated. Whether it's crop failures in the Northern Triangle, also known as the dry corridor, forcing families to move internally, which exposes these families, to discrimination and violence, and ultimately leads to migration northwards. Or US citizens today receiving taxpayer dollars to resettle due to a climate disaster, we see these devastating consequences already. And in all cases, people displaced by disasters and slow onset environmental changes have needs and vulnerabilities that must be directly addressed. And so that's why we are here today. As our hundreds of thousands of clients are members of some of the world's most vulnerable populations, we're particularly attuned to the threats and direct effects of climate change. And so I want to thank the hundreds of people who are tuning in out of the hundreds of events that I know are happening, this week. We are one of only a few, if not the only events this week that is specifically focused on the issue of climate migration. So again, I encourage you to participate by asking questions. I know that we already have a couple, and really we are so glad to have you here. So now it's my pleasure to introduce the panel of esteemed speakers and discussion panelists. Walter Kalin is Professor Emeritus for International and Swiss Constitutional Law at the University of Bern, Switzerland. He is the envoy of the chair of the Platform on Disaster Displacement and the former envoy of the chairmanship of the Nansen Initiative on Disaster-Induced Cross-Border Displacement. He presently supports the UN High-Level Panel on Internal Displacement as a member of its expert advisory group. Previously, he served as representative of the United Nations Secretary General on the human rights of internally displaced persons, as well as a member of the UN Human Rights Committee. Faye Matthews is the legal policy advisor for the National Wildlife Federation's Mississippi River Delta Restoration Program and Gulf Restoration Program. As legal policy advisor, Faye provides day-to-day advice and solutions to challenges faced by various ecosystems of the disaster and rich Gulf region and by communities that have been impacted by some of the nation's worst disasters. Previously, Faye worked on Capitol Hill as legislative counsel on the U.S. Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources for Senator Maria Cantwell from Washington State and former Senator Mary Landrieu from Louisiana. Faye worked as of counsel at the law firm Walter Wagle and Garside in Gretna, Louisiana, specializing in environmental law. And then David Gardner is president of David Gardner and Associates, which focuses on climate change and clean energy issues and advises nonprofit and for-profit organizations. He serves as executive director of the Combined Heat and Power Alliance. His firm coordinates Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, the Renewable Thermal Collaborative, and helps eliminate barriers that prevent corporate consumers from buying renewable and other forms of clean energy. Prior to founding this firm, he served in the Clinton administration as executive director of the White House Climate Change Task Force and as assistant administrator for policy at the Environmental Protection Agency. Prior to joining EPA, Mr. Gardner was the Sierra Club's legislative director in Washington, D.C. He has Bachelor of Arts with honors from Harvard College. Thank you all for being with us. So please, if you don't mind, you can turn on your videos, video cameras. So global displacement is at a record high. And while the need to migrate due to political instability, persecution, and economic reasons has always been present, we're seeing more people on the move due to extreme weather events. The UNHCR estimates an average of 22.5 million people per year have been displaced by climate between 2000 and 2018. And the numbers are projected to keep rising. The IOM, a statistic that Colin also mentioned, estimates that by 2050, there will be 200 million climate displaced persons. So whether it's Western wildfires, hurricanes, or other natural disasters, we're starting to see climate-induced migration even here in the US. In recent weeks, the US has been undergoing simultaneous climate disasters in Oregon and California, where wildfires run rampant. The government has placed 500,000 people under evacuation orders, and millions are breathing heavily polluted air. This hurricane season has been one of the most active seasons on record. Just 3 weeks ago, over 385,000 Texans and 200,000 Louisiana residents were under mandatory evacuation orders ahead of Hurricane Laura. So Faye, I'd like to start with you. Tell us what you've observed from your experience living and working in Louisiana, and who are the most vulnerable populations to climate change?
Thank you, Krish, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to come today and talk to you, particularly about what's happening along the Gulf Coast and in Louisiana. We are particularly vulnerable, as you said, to sea level rise, and that in turn, has created the need for Louisiana to start readying itself for climate migration. This conversation is very timely, and it's usually a difficult conversation to have. So I do want to say thank you to you for setting the tone for us to talk about it. So I will start by saying that Louisiana, to me, is proof that the conversation can be had and it's a right time to start talking about it. And while we're having the conversation, people are in crisis. There are tens of thousands of people across the Gulf Coast right now who are displaced. Their homes are inhabitable. They are without water, without power. New Orleans, we are housing currently 12,000 Hurricane Laura evacuees, and there's a fallout that comes with it. So that you have sort of, you know, the planning process, but during the process, and now the recovery process is found it's found to be no different than previous disasters. We have evacuees who are having a hard time providing for their families and themselves their basic needs. Water, food, shelter, homelessness has increased. And there is a future of uncertainty. It's not all the time that you leave your house and you intend for a storm and you intend to be displaced. And that is the case with a lot of people along the Gulf Coast in Louisiana, and particularly communities of color are in low-lying areas of the coast and not necessarily inside of you know, protections, whether it's levee protection or otherwise, but that creates a vulnerability for particularly communities that are low income and communities of color, marginalized community.
Yeah, I definitely see that the phrase climate gentrification is becoming a term that I hear more and more often. And of course, you know, here in the US, it is timely in the broader conversations that we're having, but I think it is something that we're seeing globally. And so Walter, let me actually ask you this question, particularly in your former position with the UN. When did conversations on climate change and migration begin? And how have you seen it evolve?
Well, first, let me thank you for having this opportunity to contribute and to be with you. It's really great that you took up that issue in the context of the Climate Week. Actually, the discussions go back to something like 2008. I remember sitting at the table with the then High Commissioner for Refugees, now Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, other heads of UN agencies. And what was said there was, there are these climate change negotiations, but they're just talking about technical issues and money and science, but not about the people. And what we started to do there was we went to the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference 2009, really lobbying to take up the issue. A very small breakthrough 2010, when the governments recognized that forced displacement, voluntary migration, and planned relocation are part of the challenges to deal with climate change. This was really the start. Where are we now? I think that's what we are going to discuss, because there is some progress that has been made since then, even though, of course, the challenges remain huge. In terms of, again, responses, I think one thing that is important, and what we just heard from Louisiana is a good illustration, but the same thing in Oregon, etc. Most people who are displaced remain within their own countries. They become internally displaced persons, and the number of those crossing borders, fleeing to other countries, is much more limited. But still, it is a big challenge too. But let's not forget about the internally displaced persons.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point in terms of the migration dynamics that we're seeing. I never like to highlight the scope of the problem without highlighting some real solutions. And so I want to start talking about those at the beginning. So David, what types of proactive climate smart adaptation investments and projects would help improve the resilience of the vulnerable communities in these regions?
Well, thank you, Chris. Great to be here. I'd say, first and foremost, I think we have to have a lot of attention to our natural systems. as Colin was alluding to, and we've talked about a place like Louisiana, its marshes and sea line are vanishing into the Gulf of Mexico. And so I think thinking about how we restore natural systems is an important first step in many places in terms of providing adaptation. But I think there will be a need for technological solutions, as for example, oceans rise, that there may be infrastructure that is either needed in order to block that kind of ocean rise, or in some cases, we just simply have to move existing infrastructure from a place it might be located and move it to higher ground. So I think there's going to be a need for a very comprehensive thinking about how we adapt to the impacts of climate change, in part because the impacts are pretty widespread and diverse. Obviously, there's simply the climate getting warmer, and that creates more warmth. We're going to have to figure out how people live in higher temperatures. We're going to have to think about how crops grow in climates that may be both hotter and drier and wetter and cooler. There's just a variety of things that the broad impacts of climate change will cause across the planet. And in some cases, we do not know what all of those impacts are, and we'll just simply have to figure out how to adapt as we go forward.
Yeah. Thank you, David, for those insights in terms of what we can and what we are doing to reduce frankly, the need for climate migration. Sometimes I think it's really important to highlight that when we get to the discussion on displacement and people fleeing, that really is the last resort, right? And so anything that we can do to prevent it, I think is critically important. So obviously we know that climate migrants are moving across international borders and being internally displaced, as Walter mentioned. So I'd like to discuss where we are globally in legally recognizing climate migration. So in 2018, the international community took an important step in recognizing climate migration through the adoption of the Global Compact on Refugees, finally identifying climate change as a driver of migration and suggesting countries work together to start planning for people that move due to natural disasters and climate change. Also on January 21st, 2020, the UN Human Rights Committee ruled that a person displaced by climate-related factors should not be returned to his or her home country if his or her human rights are in jeopardy. But at present, no country has a legal avenue for accepting and protecting climate migrants. Obviously, New Zealand did try to introduce a humanitarian visa. And in fact, there's actually even disagreement on the appropriate terminology to use when referring to climate migrants. Even the phrase climate refugees is viewed as a controversial phrase. So Walter, I'd like to turn to you first. How can the international legal community work to ensure protections for climate migrants? And how should we legally define this population? What are the international or multilateral avenues that could help to overcome some of these challenges and develop consensus on legal protections?
Well, there are different approaches. One you mentioned, the Global Compact on Refugees, but even more the Global Compact on Migration. The Global Compact on Migration is focusing not so much on people who really just have to flee, because then it's very late, then you're in a very difficult position. The Global Compact on Migration is looking at people who see there is no future for us here. And the call is to open up migration pathways, possibilities to immigrate in a regular manner, but from areas that are becoming inhabitable in the future. That's one approach, but that's a recommendation, it's not more than that. What is probably more tangible is what we can see in some of the regions. I've been involved in drafting, together with African experts, a protocol on free movement of persons in the IGAD region. IGAD, that's the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, etc., where there is drought, and drought there is really the driver of displacement. And this text, which should be adopted very soon by the heads of states, actually says that people who are victims displaced by a disaster have the right to profit from this arrangement on free movement of persons. And these are agreements that usually are done for economic reasons. But here we open that avenue now for our category of people. If we're going down to country levels, then what is particularly interesting is the region south of where you sit. We had been working with Central American governments. What came out is this guide to effective practices on the protection of people displaced across borders in the context of disasters and effects of climate change. And what we saw is that these countries in Central America, because they have so many disasters and people are moving across borders, they already have legal instruments in their laws. Humanitarian visa, temporary protection, not US style. The US temporary protection is about non-deportation. There it's about admission. Some countries use their regular migration law. Some even have expanded the refugee definition. So there, again, it's volatile. It's not kind of fixed and uniform, but good practices. What does it mean? First, it means, as I said, we started 10 years ago. That's very short when we're talking about development of international law. Then we had 3 lines in that one resolution coming out of Cancun. Now we have a global compact with these ideas, not sending back. We do have the Human Rights Committee decision and so on and so on, regional efforts at domestic levels. What to me it means, it doesn't make sense to have very long discussions about should we call them this or should we call them that? It's more about developing a toolbox, using all the different means we have in international law, migration law, refugee law, particularly human rights law, domestic laws, regional soft law, and then bring it together. And my hope, and that's what we are very much doing at the level of the Platform on Disaster Displacement with governments that lead that process. We're trying to push these discussions and not top-down imposing some clear-cut idea or definition. And then hopefully, but we have to be optimistic, something will grow out of it.
Yeah, I think we have to be hopeful, and thank you for your dedication over years and years in terms of making that headway. To your point about exploring every avenue that we can, David, I actually want to ask you about the role of non-governmental actors. So you have worked across sectors in building alliances and partnerships to address climate change. How do you see nonprofits, businesses, corporations coming together to address the humanitarian toll of climate change?
Well, I think both all kinds of organizations can play a role in terms of trying to both address the impacts on people who must migrate because of the kinds of climate changes that we're seeing, but also in providing solutions on climate change too. I think one of the most exciting features that we've seen in the last decade or so has been the substantial rise in, for example, interest on the part of large corporations to solving climate change and to stepping forward. Companies just this week are making important announcements about decarbonizing not just their own operations, but their supply chains and other kinds of things. And I think they're doing that in part because they recognize the seriousness of climate. But also I think they recognize too that there are big economic opportunities. And I think we've got to, clean energy is a gigantic job creator, but I think we've also found that as we work at it and we scale it up, it becomes less and less expensive. And this is, I think, going to also be an important part of the evolving debate here is how can we take those clean energy solutions that companies and non-governmental organizations and others are pushing forward and make sure that refugees have access to them as well. How do we put not only solar energy and other kinds of things like that at refugee camps, but what can we do when people hopefully leave those refugee camps and are reinstated back into society. Often we have challenges delivering clean energy and affordable energy to people at the lowest end of the economic scale. And there are very significant opportunities to do that. And I think NGOs and companies and others can work together and should be working together to try to figure out how to move those solutions forward.
And Faye, I want to round out this second set of questions with you. So what are some of the ways that you have seen the local community work to protect the rights of people that have been displaced or are vulnerable to it?
Hey, so what I will say is I think that what is happening in Louisiana with respect to sort of like the upfront planning and the sort of desire to consult with communities and collaborate with communities and give communities the choice in what their future looks like. Louisiana is a model for that. I will say that. We're not doing everything right, but we are on the forefront. We have a very ambitious state coastal master plan designed to restore our coast, which has eroded at a rapid rate. And with hurricanes, we lose big chunks of land. And then there's the slow creeping crisis, which is sea level rise. So with that, Louisiana is in the process of implementing, and we've implemented some projects, our $50 billion 50-year coastal master plan that's designed to keep people in their communities for as long as possible. But on the flip side of that, and we also recognize that at some point, restoring those lands won't be enough. And Louisiana recognized that we're gonna have to move people. And if people have to move, if people will be forced to move, whether they make an upfront decision to do that relocation themselves. And I will say that there are people who have been retreating from the coast for decades. But how do we include community? How do you make sure that it's a community decision as opposed to handing them their future? It's inevitable, right? What we're seeing with respect to climate, increased hurricanes, more intense hurricanes, sea level rise, those things aren't changing, and projections are pretty bleak. How do you ready communities for that? So Louisiana has invested in the upfront planning process, which part of it is designed to keep people in place for as long as possible. And on the backside, it's allowing communities to decide what they want to do. For instance, part of the Louisiana Strategic Adaptation Future Environment Project gives communities the option to say what they want. So it's one project per parish. It was in part funded through a National Disaster Resiliency Resiliency Competition grant. And the communities can decide. The sort of low-lying areas are divided, and those areas are identified, and community members can say, we want to, as a community, move to a certain place, or we want to have a mental health facility, right? So one thing that we don't talk about is the climate trauma, the trauma that comes with climate displacement. And one community did decide, we want to stay here for as long as possible. And to do that, this is what we need. So we are making strides, and changes are happening whether we like it or not. But the idea is to keep people in place as long as possible, but also let people have a decision, right? Let them decide what their future looks like. And right now we have a decision. We have a decision. We can decide to be proactive and bold and move forward, or we can have our future handed to us. We want to make sure that people are involved.
No, and I think that is such an important insight in terms of not just treating these individuals as subjects, but active participants, knowing that this is, you know, their fate in their as well as our hands. So the final set of questions that I will ask are really kind of focused on legislation here at home, but also in terms of what the international community is undertaking. So in the last couple of years, we have seen an increase in proposed legislation to address climate change in the US. US states are also taking up legislative proposals, creating task forces, as well as taking executive actions on reducing emissions, increasing renewable energy, and financing opportunities for clean energy, as we've discussed. But cities and communities need greater assistance and preparations for adapting to population influxes from climate displacement. And so, you know, I think one reality we know is that we've got to build capacity for newcomers in employment, housing, financial, and health services, including what Faye mentioned in terms of the mental toll that this takes. So David, I'll turn to you first. How can we ensure that climate migration is addressed in future policies at the domestic level? What do you think are the key elements that should be included in future legislation?
Well, as I said in my earlier comments, I really think that this is an important topic to get into the conversations. And I think, especially in the United States, we're seeing substantial conversation about, in particular, how to deal with communities that may have challenges on their own, whether they're part of migrants or not. And I think that's very healthy. And as I mentioned, I think particularly on the solution side, there are lots of opportunities to help, for example, cut people's energy bills. Energy efficiency is a kind of boring topic, but boy, is it a terrific climate solution that saves people money. And that's obviously especially important for people at the low end of the economic spectrum. I'm glad, Krish, that you mentioned that. I think there are policy opportunities at every level of government. I certainly think there are lots of tools that local communities have to not only adapt in the way that Faye has been talking about, but also to think about how to reduce the energy use that really is the fundamental cause of climate change, and how to shift to clean energy. I think that's true at the state level. As you mentioned, there are states, I happen to live in Virginia, which recently adopted new clean energy legislation that's very ambitious and really very good. I think there are opportunities at the federal level. Obviously, the election will have an impact on that. And we should not forget the importance of the Paris Climate Change Agreement internationally. It's really set up a mechanism where over the course of the future, about every 5 years, every country will have an opportunity to basically consider how to make its commitment to deal with climate change stronger. You know, I think that means that every citizen around the world and NGOs and others have opportunities to frankly push their national governments to say we can do more, and to make that kind of commitment internationally, because we are certainly on a global scale falling well short of what we need to do to keep the planet from warming to the levels that countries committed to do in the Paris Agreement.
Yeah. So Faye, are there successful examples of how the Gulf Coast region has implemented or pursued policies that address displaced people? And if not, are there policies that you would recommend cities and states implement?
So I am probably most in tune with Louisiana's coastal plan and its adaptation strategy that is focused on sort of like the recognition that at some point people will need to move, and how do we ready that? That's important. I would say that that's a really good example or proof that this conversation can happen, and that we can find ways to make sound investments on the forefront as opposed to making them on the back end. I would say that those planning processes to the extent that other states are adopting them, or at the regional level, they are being forward thinking. We're not going to get it right, but we have to do something. Inaction is an action, and we can decide. Hurricane Laura damages have to date alone, it's up to $10 billion and it's rising. People are still displaced. So I think it's important to make those upfront investments so that we're making sure that we not only are preparing people for, life inside of climate change, whatever that looks like over the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years, but we're also doing it in a way that creates a space for people to thrive and to be okay.
Yeah, and I think
the last thing that I would say, Krish, is that it's important to make investments up front, invest in vulnerable communities to make decisions about what's happening to them for planning, invest in receiving communities. Receiving communities we're seeing in Louisiana with Hurricane Laura, we had a city outright reject evacuees because of a local security threat concern. And it's the general sentiment with this issue, right? It's a very sensitive issue, but it sort of gets exasperated now. So investments upfront, investments in receiving communities, and injecting equity along the way, and not as a on the top icing on the cake. It needs to be baked into that policy. Otherwise, we're going to perpetuate some of the same systems, and vulnerable communities, marginalized communities will end up at the end. It will impact all of us. So I think there's a sentiment that, what's happening, if it's not at my front door, then it's not happening to me, but it's in our backyard. And we have to be able to be good neighbors to each other.
Yeah, Faye, and I think it's a great example, the one you referred to of Fayette, that rejected, what you would maybe call climate refugees in the immigration space. We see those, concerns, fears of security. And when people know that, in fact, actually, when you look at international refugees, they actually make communities significantly safer, whether it's violent crime, economic crime, etc. It is interesting to see that xenophobia is relatable to what we are saying, even with American populations against American populations. So the final question that I'll ask, it'll go to Walter. At the international level, what kind of role can the UN and the international community play to support these actions? And what are the top 3 actions that countries should undertake to play their role in terms of managing climate-related displacement?
Well, I think I can build on what Faye said. Upfront investment, the role of communities. What we are promoting within the UN, the different systems, different processes, is really what we call a toolbox approach. It's helping people to stay. And this is about disaster risk reduction. This is about climate change adaptation, all the things she mentioned. Building the resilience of communities so that people can stay, helping them to stay. But it doesn't work all the time. So in some situations, we have to help people to move out of harm's way. That's planned relocation within countries. That's migration pathways to other countries. And again, that's where we can do a lot of things. And we can manage some of it. But then still, some people will remain, will become displaced, forced to flee just to save their lives. And there it's about better protection for internally displaced persons. And there it's what we already discussed, to use different available tools to allow people to move to other countries. Why am I so much insisting on this toolbox approach? One of the big problems internationally is that we're working in silos. We have the disaster risk community, we have the climate change community, we have the migration community, we have the human rights community, and we have to bring that together. And I think you mentioned the fact, the real big challenge is, how can we convince politicians and populations to open borders? I don't think that we can convince them by saying there will be millions and millions. I mean, this is just triggering negative reactions. We're closing our doors. What we need to show is that we can do a lot to prevent, that we can do a lot to manage. And then, of course, what remains there, it's simply a precept of humanity to help these people, to assist them.
I think that is such a positive to note. My questions for the panel, but because we have a lot of questions coming from the audience, I am going to try to ask a couple at a time, and anyone should feel free to jump in and respond to one or both. First question comes from Rachel. Are there efforts to provide solar and other clean energy in refugee camps other than Zaatari camp in Jordan? And from Laura, what do you think of the alternatives to changing the legal refugee definition to include climate migration? I'm curious as to your thoughts on other options such as reducing emissions, supporting adaptation efforts, and for expanding access to employment-based visa options. So I'll just take a quick crack at just the one part in terms of changing the legal definition to include climate migrants. Honestly, when we look at what the presidential determination number is for accepting refugees right now, we are really at a rock bottom low of 18,000. Our view at LIRS is that we wouldn't want a number for climate displaced migrants or refugees to cannibalize the number that is so low when it comes to, sort of the traditionally defined refugees. Our hope is actually to kind of grow the pie. Senator Markey had proposed legislation last year to create a 50,000 allocation for this newly defined set, and so we would support a separate avenue for climate displaced persons to come into the U.S. But other panelists would welcome your thoughts on either of the questions.
So I just jump in by saying yes, the UN Refugee Agency has an effort driving to put solar plants at refugee camps, and this is an important thing, providing multiple benefits. Not only is it good for climate change in terms of dealing with the solution, but obviously we're providing electricity, which we all, I think, in the developed world take for granted. Refugees cannot, and I think it provides opportunities to improve educational opportunities for refugees by delivering that electricity. It's obviously a clean source of electricity, so the alternatives, most of them would be dirtier, so this is cleaner, both delivering cleaner air and cleaner water and healthier. So I think this is a really good initiative and exactly the sorts of things that we need to be thinking about as we go forward in terms of integrating climate solutions into the most vulnerable populations around the world so that they get the multiple benefits that come from it that people who may be better off and more empowered are also able to get.
If I may come in on the refugee definition, I think internationally there is growing consensus that just to expand the refugee definition would not be a good way to address this issue. Why? First, it would make it even more difficult for those who really are fleeing wars and political persecution to get admission. But more importantly, in the case of refugees, people need international protection because people back home, the government or insurgents, turn against them. But in the case of those who have to flee in the context of climate change and disasters, their own government doesn't turn against them. They try to help them. So in terms of policy responses, you can work and cooperate with countries of origin. It's very difficult to cooperate with Syria, for instance. And if we would mix up all of that, I think we would reduce our policy options. So it's really about, yes, looking at migration pathways, looking at things like, as I said, humanitarian visa, new avenues, and that's where we have to work. And even if you're early on in terms of the legal discussion, what exactly will it be? And it also will be different from regions to regions. As I said, in the Horn of Africa, they are very much focusing on free movement of persons. The same thing in Western Africa, ECOWAS region. In the Pacific, where we're working, supporting governments there to start a discussion on the regional human mobility framework. It probably will be very much about migration quota, things like that. And that's probably the more fruitful way than to advocate for an expansion of the refugee definition. And as I said, it might have very negative side effects.
So Walter, this question will be for you. We got a question from Gladys as well as Catherine. Could you provide the link to the booklet that you showed us? This is the brochure about protection of persons. So if there's a link that maybe you could include or direct the audience to.
I would have to, yeah, I can try, yes.
Okay, all right, great. And there's the chat box, or otherwise in a follow-up email, we can make sure that we send that out to the attendees. Then I have a couple questions. So one is actually from John Moeller, one of our CEOs of Inspiritus, that's part of the LIRS network and such a partner for us on the ground. John asks, what are a few examples of communities that have welcomed climate displaced persons? I know Atlanta did after Hurricane Katrina. So maybe Faye, you could jump in there, but obviously others feel free. And then from Carmen, many land and water protectors here are treated as criminals. In other countries, land protectors are murdered by their governments, Honduras, Brazil, Mexico, the Amazon forest area. What do organizations do to call attention to this?
Hey, Krish, I will go ahead. I answered John in the chat, but I will start by saying there are countless communities that were incredibly kind to evacuees during and after Katrina. Many of us we for the most part, the migration patterns showing that some people didn't return. We settled in communities where we found better lives, communities in Louisiana and across the country gladly accept refugees in a sense that it's an urgent issue. And I mean, I'm seeing countless news reports where states and communities are really stepping in to support evacuees. Nonprofit organizations are stepping into it to support evacuees. So I do want to highlight the Dallas, for instance. They are, there's a group that's taken resources and set aside, and today they're doing they're enrolling a bunch of evacuees in schools across. People are incredibly kind when, shelter, people are stepping in. People do step up. Our neighbors do step up. So I didn't want to insinuate in any way that we weren't generally being nice to our neighbor. But in the larger regard, the question is, how do we ready all communities to feel like they have that capacity to take on evacuees? Because some communities don't feel like, some cities, they just don't feel like they have the capacity. So it's a fear factor. And I think, Walter, to your point, I think it's important for us to have the conversation and then make the point that it's not an issue that's not manageable. So that's very important. And then, so Krish, if I can take one more minute, I just want to go back to highlight a couple of things that probably can change in policy up front. And it's urgent a little. We have found that there are fragmentations across federal policy when we talk about planning and preparation during disasters and after disasters, communities of color tend to have less information, fewer loans, less government relief. And when you start talking about individual assistance, there's a real gap where individuals who have basic needs for now, today, for yesterday, and the day before that, they don't have access to resources. We are seeing communities, community members, residents, individuals be denied with no explanation. We're seeing people be denied. I mean, after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, there were 77,000 people who were denied access because they could not prove title to their property, right? So like, there's some practices that are discriminatory in effect, and it doesn't allow recourse for people who are marginalized to have any relief. And it's discouraging, it's demoralizing. So to start, we can shore up that federal program, we can shore up our national flood insurance program. We can find ways. One of the things that Louisiana's program does is to sort of let people know what their development area is. FEMA right now doesn't have an enforcement tool to really say, you know, you're not building in a place that's compliant. So people are going back to areas that are, you know, that are vulnerable. And then on the other side of that, I know FEMA is, you know, not the lead agency with respect to climate. We don't have any lead agency with respect to climate migration, but when you start talking about emergency and short-term disaster recovery, FEMA does need that capacity. So I think those are probably immediate reforms that can be made. And then on the front end of FEMA's planning grants, can we start thinking of ways to give community capacity for, or waive some cost share, some relief for cost share requirements? I know there's a certain population requirement that doesn't allow FEMA to waive cost shares if a population is so big. We saw that problem in parts of Alaska, and much like the tribe of Ile de Jean Charles in Louisiana, which the tribe has been known by media as America's first climate refugees. That community, it took upwards of 15 years to come up with its cost share requirement, cost share to move. So those are some policy changes that are immediate. Those are things we can probably do, but in the longer term, we really have to think about how we invest on the front end. And I think at some point, managing climate disasters will be cost prohibitive. We've found it. We've had issues with cost prohibitions in Louisiana, and we see it with projects across America. We have to start investing yesterday, or we are in trouble for tomorrow. And then we create situations where it's too big of a problem for us to deal with. So before we get there, which the problem, in my opinion, is already too big, my personal opinion, but we have to really make those investments in the community and give communities an option.
Yeah.
Chris, could I just say on the question about advocates for clean water and clean air being criminalized or murdered, look, I think we're not doing enough broadly to shine a spotlight on the people who are the victims of climate change, the migration focus of today. And important also to recognize that those who are advocating for the changes that we need in order to fix climate change are also being victimized and literally murdered. And that's important to do because I think climate change is often a very abstract issue. And we need to make it about people. And these are the people who are, on the one hand, the victims, and on the other hand, the advocate for the very changes that we need to have happen. And they are being victimized in different ways, but they are all victims because they're they're either experiencing the change which is happening or trying to make the change that we need to have happen.
I appreciate that. So I know we are at time, but I want to just ask a flurry of a few last questions for everyone to use perhaps to close this out. I think this question particularly is for you, Walter. How can we cope with the withdrawal of traditional leaders like the United States in the humanitarian space, especially when it comes to pressing questions like climate displacement and migration? We have a few questions just in terms of, what steps are being taken to allow climate displaced individuals to vote in the upcoming election and future ones, as well as, will our work be impacted by an administration, should Trump be reelected, and a Supreme Court whose majority may not care as much about environmental climate change? And then the final question for everyone is, what sources of information and recommendations would you direct the audience to go to after this webinar?
Okay, it's a bit difficult for me as a European to comment on your politics, but what I have to say is that US leadership at the international level would be so absolutely important right now. Because what we see in the present vacuum, others are moving in, and they are not always the best intentioned. So go and vote.
Well put, as concisely and powerful as I think any one of us could. Faye, David, did you want to jump in?
Well, I would just say that, I think there are lots of sources of information on the solutions. In some cases, that's a big challenge that it's too much. But as you pointed out earlier, Krish, and Colin certainly reflects, there are many non-governmental organizations that are terrific advocates for climate solutions. I think and many of them also provide good examples of things that are happening. So I would point people towards a lot of the NGOs that are really working in this field, whether they're in the US or elsewhere around the globe. And of course, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has produced many documents written for policymakers, so they're relatively easy to understand. I think they're a terrific source of good information.
And I would, I'm going to be biased for a minute, direct to Louisiana's State Coastal Master Plan and its adaptation plan. And I would encourage people to just consider, even with an issue that's so highly politicized and so taboo when you don't talk about it, it's something you just steer away from, the conversation can be had. So I think that's important to recognize. It's a moment that's important to realize. And even if, you have huge ideological beliefs one way or another, it's important to remember that it's people.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end. I know Ed had asked a question about what would LIRS ask for, the next administration, and for us, it's action on the climate crisis, on immigration, and of course, at the intersection of these two hot button, critically important topics at this time. Climate displacement is how people will be affected by the climate crisis. And we're seeing it here at home, we're seeing it abroad. And I think we're realizing more than we have ever before that we are in this together. And if we don't act, what we will see today will unfortunately only get worse. So let me just end by saying, I think in some ways we scratched the surface on this topic, but I think as some of you noted in your questions, this issue doesn't get as much attention as it needs, which is why LIRS, working with some of the organizations represented here, will be tackling this in the months to come. So please, feel free to continue to stay tuned. And just please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists, Walter, Faye, and David. And thank you for joining our conversation today. We encourage you to visit the LIRS website, which is www.lirs.org, and to follow us on social media and learn how you can be engaged in our future climate migration efforts. We know that we need action. We need you all to be ambassadors engaged on the ground. And so we will, working with experts like the ones you saw and heard from today, be directing such action. So again, thank you so much for tuning in, and we look forward to following this and continuing this conversation.